Welcome to the Ask John Project, Week 3. We're joined today with John Kaminski. We have questions from North Glen High School in Colorado, Maine South High School in Illinois, and some other schools as well. Let's get right to it, John, on the STEM question, the bold part of the question. There's a couple of things maybe to flesh out here. Number one, it seems the STEM seems to assume that there were Anti-Federalists at the convention. Is that true, or Anti-Federalist a later term?
I don't like to use the term Federalist and Anti-Federalist in referring to delegates at the Constitutional Convention, because that presupposes that they have a constitution that they're either opposed to or supportive of. In actuality, there is no constitution until the Constitution is agreed to at the very end. There is a draft constitution in the making, and in fact, some delegates who start out at the beginning, they might be very Federalist oriented, and a good example there would be the two Virginians, George Mason and Governor Edmund Randolph. Randolph submits the Virginia Plan, in fact, on the first day of debate in the convention. But in the end, they turn around and they don't sign the Constitution. Whereas you have another person like William Patterson from New Jersey, who is the one who introduces the New Jersey Plan mid-June, and so he's against a strong central government at that point. But once you get equality of the states, including the small states, represented equally in the U.S. Senate, there's no more ardent nationalist in the convention than William Patterson. And so the convention is a transitional type thing. There's no Federalists there, there's no Anti-Federalists. There are men who have a proclivity. And so the term federal man began in 1786, applying to those people who wanted to give more power to the Confederation Congress. And when you have that term federal man, you have other men who would be opposed to that. They were known as anti-federal men. So these terms sort of morphed over time into supporting and attacking the Constitution. There's a great deal of opposition among the Anti-Federalists saying that these terms were misused, that the Federalists should be those people who support smaller government, the state governments, and not a strong central government, and those who favor a strong central government should be known as nationalists. And so the Anti-Federalists didn't like the nomenclature that was there, that the nomenclature that was foisted upon them and the American public by the Federalists. And so there are people in the Constitutional Convention that do favor a smaller central government, don't want to see this expansion, this consolidation of power. And so there are these individuals we later call Anti-Federalists. So you see men like Luther Martin and John Lansing Jr. and Robert Yates, those two from New York, Elbridge Gerry, who starts out pretty strongly Federalist oriented, but becomes an Anti-Federalist. So certainly there are a number of delegates in the convention who we would later call Anti-Federalists. It's interesting to see that there were 74 different individuals elected to the convention, 55 attended, and of those 55, only 42 were there on the last day, 3 of whom did not sign. If you want to be very technical about it, there were only 41 there because John Dickinson left early, but left his proxy to vote with his fellow Delawarean, George Reed. So if you look at that number 42 there on the last day, of the 55 that were there all total, that means that 13 delegates left prematurely before the Constitution was signed. And some of those delegates left for family reasons. George Wyth's wife died. Was very sick, and she did eventually die. So he left for that reason. Others had state responsibilities as judges, and others like Yates and Lansing from New York didn't like the direction that the convention was going in. These Anti-Federalists there at the convention, so they left, never to return again.
So let's talk a little bit more about Robert Yates and John Lansing Jr. Why Would you consider them non-signers since they left in the middle of the summer?
Well, you can't consider them non-signers since they didn't have the opportunity to sign. And there are others that left early, and some of those would support the Constitution, others not. Actually, there's only one delegate who left and then came back, and that was Alexander Hamilton. And not only did he leave once, he left twice, and then he came back, and then he was unrepresented. He didn't officially represent New York because you have to have two delegates to have an official delegation. And with the two New Yorkers, Lansing and Yates, gone, Hamilton was there alone. He could debate, but he couldn't vote. His vote didn't count, and he shouldn't have signed. But he did sign for New York, and there was some controversy over that. And so those delegates who left, I wouldn't necessarily call them non-signers. They were just delegates who came and then left.
Let's move on to the first bullet point, the second part of the question. Caroline from Maine South has a question that I've slightly changed. Is it fair to say that the Anti-Federalists spoke for most Americans, or were they voicing a minority opinion?
The Anti-Federalists probably spoke for many Americans, and the question is always what's the percentage, and that changes at any particular time. Gouverneur Morris in the Constitutional Convention, Morris originally from Pennsylvania, but originally from New York, but representing Pennsylvania in the convention, said we ought to ratify the Constitution quickly because the more time that elapses, the more time that the people look at the Constitution, the greater the opposition will be. And so that's exactly what happened. There was a sense, whatever the convention is going to give us, we ought to adopt. And so when the convention ended in mid-September 1787, I would venture to say 90 to 95% of the Americans supported what they saw coming out of that convention. After all, Washington and Franklin were in the convention and they supported it. But as time went on, that percentage decreased. And you now have several newspapers who do oppose the Constitution, and the propaganda that's there, the public debate, newspaper articles, pamphlets, broadsides, the Anti-Federalists are heavily involved in that, and they are convincing folks. So that by the time the Massachusetts Convention is elected in late December of 1787, we're only talking about 2.5, 3 months after the Constitution was announced, there's probably a majority of the Americans who oppose the Constitution without previous amendments being adopted. And so I would say there's no Federalist in the country that accepts everything in the Constitution. Everybody in the country finds something wrong with the Constitution. And that's something that is sort of, when you think about it, it's sort of common sense. It's a constitution creating a government that is a compromise. And it's a compromise of different sections and different walks of life. And when you have compromise, somebody wins and somebody loses a little bit. And so no one usually supports a compromise totally. So I would say, looking at the different populations, there are probably 90 to 95% of Americans at this time are farmers or involved in farming. And when you have the Constitution that is so divisive, so that you might say maybe 50% of the population is anti-federal and 50% federal, both parties are heavily composed of farmers. And so, sometimes farmers that have different points of view, that is, those farmers who export some of their goods, and those farmers who are more or less self-sufficient, particularly on the frontier, in the backcountry. And so I would say the Anti-Federalists represented many of the farmers. For the most part, they did not represent the learned professions. And so the merchants, the lawyers, the physicians, these folks are mainly represented by the Federalists. The townsfolks who are involved in shops and in shipbuilding and things of that nature, things associated with commerce. These folks, for the most part, are Federalists, partly because of the economic depression that had so severely hit the United States, the post-war depression. But it hit very hard late 1784, 1785, and they did not really perceive that by the end of 1787, they were really coming out of that depression. And so there's this sense that perhaps the Constitution, the new government, will give prosperity a better chance to return. And so a lot of these folks in the towns were Federalist oriented. But the Anti-Federalists were very strong in the backcountry. They also had several other elements that supported them. One would be state office holders. They were a little fearful that they might lose some of their power. So this is a selfish reason that they're accused of opposing the Constitution. Often state judges opposed the Constitution, again, because they thought that the federal judges might supersede them. So they were concerned about their positions. So the country is pretty well divided, and Anti-Federalists are representing many individuals, heavily certain individuals like judges and state office holders, and not too much on the part of some other folks like merchants and clergy and lawyers. I should mention, however, when I mention clergy, there are certain elements of the clergy that are very much in opposition to the Constitution. So, for instance, Baptists, they're fearful the Constitution doesn't have a clause for freedom of religion. So the country, to the great extent, is pretty evenly divided.
I think this leads to a good spot to start talking about some of the issues. And Chase from North Glen High School wants to know, other than the lack of a Bill of Rights, were there other major issues for the Anti-Federalists?
I'd say there could be two issues that we could look at. Every clause of the Constitution has its opponents. And sometimes those opponents are in fact Anti-Federalists. Other times they're Federalists. And so it's not just the Anti-Federalists that oppose some clauses. But the Anti-Federalists have two broad oppositions to the Constitution. One is the lack of the Bill of Rights that Chase mentioned, but the other would be the ambiguity involved in the new federal-state relationship, the concept of federalism. And how do you determine where that line is to be drawn? You have the Supremacy Clause that says that the Constitution, laws passed in pursuance of the Constitution, and treaties are the supreme law of the land, notwithstanding anything in state constitutions or bills of rights. And so in that regard, it's quite clear that in any controversies, the federal government is going to win because of the Supremacy Clause, and that the determination as to if a state law, let's say, violates the supreme law of the land, it's the federal judiciary that will be making that decision. And so those Anti-Federalists that oppose the Constitution, they say, if there's any choice of the matter, if there is ambiguity, it's going to be decided by federal judges. So we know what direction that they're going to go in. And so this sense of ambiguity that's there is between federal-state relations is a major concern. And Anti-Federalists believe that there will be a consolidation of power, and that will be superimposed on the states. And so with that power, where is the fear? Well, to a great extent, it comes from the Necessary and Proper Clause. How powerful will that make the central government? There is no provision in the Constitution equivalent to Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, which says that the states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and Congress has only those powers that are expressly delegated to it by the Articles themselves. That's not there in the new Constitution. Nothing is mentioned about the states retaining their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So it looks as if sovereignty is going someplace. Federalists would say, the people are sovereign. Well, I don't know that Anti-Federalists buy into that. They think the federal government will be sovereign. And they're worried about that necessary and proper clause. Federalists will say that applies only to the delegated powers, whatever is necessary to implement those delegated powers. Anti-Federalists say, no, it's open-ended. It will be anything that Congress decides it wants to be. And in fact, when you see Alexander Hamilton defending the Bank of the United States in 1791, where he says, yes, there are implied powers, as well as he uses the term express powers. And he says the implied powers as are effectual, these are his words now, as effectually delegated as the express powers. So he's saying there are implied powers and they're readily there for the Congress to utilize. That Constitution, that ambiguous Constitution, is in a malleable state for a long time. And it's waiting for a activist judge to step in, who happens to be named John Marshall. And in the McCulloch case, in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, he says there are many implied powers, and the states have absolutely no authority to limit those implied powers. And when we get even the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which was proposed in 1789 and adopted in 1791, the 10th Amendment, when they're debating that in Congress, they leave out the word expressly in the phrase delegated powers. And so even the 10th Amendment still has that ambiguity that's there as to where is that line that draws the border between federal and state relations. James Madison said he didn't think the 10th Amendment did anything that the Constitution didn't do. And I think he was exactly right. Both of them were ambiguous. And so that was a serious problem. I must say that, and it's a problem that stays with us today. But there was another serious problem at that time, serious for the country, that the Anti-Federalists mentioned. And that was obviously the question of slavery. And the delegates to the Constitutional Convention did nothing really to consider the emancipation of slaves. The provisions, there are 3 provisions concerning slavery in the Constitution. They all support slave owners or maybe even reward them. So you have the 3/5 clause granting both representation status to 3/5 of the slave population, as well as if there's direct taxation, that will be a portion among 3/5 of the states, counting 3/5 of the slaves. And then there will be the foreign slave trade will remain open for 20 years. That's to satisfy the Deep South, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina to a certain extent. They want to replenish their slaves that they lost during the Revolution. Well, what damage can't you do in 20 years? And then finally, there's the Fugitive Slave Clause that was taken from the recently adopted Northwest Ordinance. You get a prohibition of slavery in the Northwest Territory, but when that is accomplished, largely through the efforts of Southerners, they don't want a competing plantation economy north of the Ohio River, but they're fearful that their slaves south of the Ohio might abscond to north of the river. So they put in a Fugitive Slave Clause, saying that runaway slaves have to be returned. Well, ironically, it's that clause that gets put into the Constitution that then plays a very important role in the coming of the Civil War with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. So roundabout, the failure of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention to address the slavery issue was a critical fault that eventually gives rise to a bloody Civil War.
John, did either side going into the ratification debates have an advantage over the other?
I would say the Federalists had a distinct advantage over the Anti-Federalists in that the country had moved in the direction of change. So there was a desire for change. There were a half dozen attempts to amend the Articles of Confederation previous to this. In every case, Congress proposed an amendment that would strengthen itself. And on each occasion, many Americans favored that, but because of the unanimity provision for amending the Articles, that provision in Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't achieve that unanimity. And so what you could see is that there was a strong desire in the country for change from the very beginning, change in the Articles. But the impost of 1781 is a good example. 12 of the 13 states ratify it. Tiny little Rhode Island did not ratify it. And so what you have is 1/50th of the population. Of that small population, a very slim majority didn't want to ratify the impost of 1781, which was going to give Congress a short-term tariff power. And so what it was saying is that 95% of Americans favored that provision. And so as long as they were working under the Articles of Confederation with that virtually impossible method of ratifying, anybody that wanted change was going to face difficulty. But the American people were ripe for change. And so Federalists understood that, and they adjusted the ratification procedure to make it possible, not easy, but possible to get those changes adopted. They also had two other tremendous advantages. And that was, I'll give you the names of these people, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. These two men were in the Constitutional Convention. They signed the Constitution, and the argument was by Federalists, if Washington and Franklin support the Constitution, who are you to oppose it? And that's a pretty tough question for an individual to answer. So that was another advantage. Another advantage that the Federalists had was that of the 90 newspapers that were being published in the country at that time, probably only 6 of them turned out to be anti-Federalist. Another 6 were really neutral, but that meant that 78 of the 90 newspapers in the country were strongly oriented toward adopting the Constitution. And this is where the public debate was largely played out, was in the newspaper debate that took place. Strong anti-Federalist, strong Federalist advantage.
Did the Anti-Federalists successfully exploit the secrecy of the convention to their advantage?
Secrecy was a major issue, and they tried to take advantage of it. They condemned the Constitutional Convention for being a dark conclave that is trying to associate it with Catholics and the College of Cardinals, and how they would appoint a new pope. And so there was that argument that was there. But for the most part, secrecy in public bodies was common at that time. Parliament, it held its debates in secret, and you couldn't publish the debates. Most of the state legislatures and the Confederation Congress were held in secret. The journals were published, but a lot of the journals that dealt with foreign affairs and military matters and some personnel matters would not be put into the journal. So secrecy was part of the public arena at the time, much more so than now. And so there wasn't much opposition to that when the convention was meeting. But when it adjourned and when it submitted the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists complained that there was no opportunity to discuss the draft Constitution, to offer possible alternatives. And in fact, Cato, who is an anonymous newspaper writer in New York, we think maybe it was George Clinton, he was severely attacked by Caesar, another anonymous newspaper writer. We think maybe it was Alexander Hamilton. But Caesar attacks Cato, saying, why are you objecting to the Constitution now in late September, early October 1787? Why didn't you submit these objections earlier? That is, why didn't you submit your objections to the Constitutional Convention? Cato naturally responded, because we couldn't. You wouldn't let us. You wouldn't tell us what was going on in the Constitutional Convention. And so Anti-Federalists regularly refer to this, sometimes directly, and it's a significant article that would be attacking secrecy. More often than not, however, there'd be snide remarks that would be put in. There are other arguments saying that this was a secretive body and that there were coalitions there, anti-democratic coalitions going on, many monarchists that were there, and you don't know any of this because it was secret. Well, Luther Martin, who was one of those delegates, he's from Maryland. He's the Attorney General from Maryland. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He left early. He becomes an Anti-Federalist. He publishes, he does what he's supposed to do. He goes back to Maryland. He reports to the legislature, as he was required to do by his instructions, and he then gave his opinion, and that opinion was expanded into a lengthy series of articles called Martin's Genuine Information. And it talked about what took place in the Constitutional Convention. Much of the secrecy was unfolded in Luther Martin's objections in his Genuine Information. And it convinced some people that this was, in fact, a dangerous body and that the secrecy covered a lot of shenanigans going on in that convention. Others, however, felt, well, Martin really didn't reveal anything that was earth-shattering, and it was just, he was showing one compromise after another. And that's certainly what George Washington says in his wonderful cover letter of the 17th of September, the letter that accompanies the Constitution, sent to the letter sent to the President of Congress, in which Washington lays it out what they did. Yes, it wasn't secret, but it was lots of compromises, and we had to give up certain rights to preserve other rights, so the social compact theory. And he said he hoped that the American people would act the same way in being amenable to compromises, just as the delegates to the convention were amenable to those compromises.
I think this is probably a good spot to ask this. This comes from an anonymous school, and I've modified it a little bit, but the question essentially is, were all the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates this high-toned rhetoric and writing, or was there an element of nastiness, maybe lowbrow ratification debates?
The public debate over the Constitution runs the gamut, from the gutter and the mud to the highest levels. Certainly the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, tried to avoid partisanship. In fact, there's only a couple references to the opponents, and that's all they are references, sort of to set up straw men that could be then answered. But there's not a lot of give and take in the Federalist Papers, just responding to the arguments of the Anti-Federalists. But there are many instances of going back and forth. A good example of that occurred a little bit before this debate, but over the Constitution. But it showed the opposition to Alexander Hamilton. There's a poem in the newspaper of Matthew Carey in Philadelphia, and it referred to Alexander Hamilton's illegitimate birth. It starts out, sprung from his own dunghill young. And so it refers to that. But there's a lot of terrible references that are nasty. One of the reasons why there's no names involved here often, that they regularly use pseudonyms. Pseudonyms, the high-tone reason for pseudonyms is let's keep personality out of the debate. Let's only look at the issues. Well, there's another reason to keep names out of the debate, and that is canes and dueling. If you publicly attack somebody, that person might turn around and challenge you to a duel. There were some duels at this time. Or if you were beneath dignity, then you'd be caned. There's no reason to risk your life in a duel if you felt your opponent, your enemy, was a mere insect in your eyes. So why should you risk your life, which is valuable? Just cane the person and injure them severely. And so there was a lot of that. I remember, for instance, there was a reference to the Federalist poetry. And one of the Anti-Federalist writers said, a monkey could do a better job in coming up with poetry. Another Anti-Federalist attacked the Federalist poetry and said, it was like the Yahoos in Gulliver's Travel. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the Yahoos in Gulliver's Travels, but they were in this land where the intelligentsia, the philosophers, were in the bodies of horses, and they were the thinkers. The bodies of human beings were like savages, and they were filthy, dirty, and they were immoral. And one of the things they loved to do was to go up in trees, and they would throw their excrements down on passersby. And that's what this Anti-Federalist said the Federalist poetry was. It was excrement being tossed down on the American public. So they were in the gutters often, not just on the high levels of political rhetoric.
At one point of the ratification debates, the Anti-Federalists accused the Federalists of controlling the mail system, the number of newspapers. Could you address that issue of that accusation from the Anti-Federalists?
Yes, the post office is a branch of the Confederation government. At this particular time, a young man, Ebenezer Hazard, from Philadelphia, is the Postmaster General. He's only 33 years old. He's a Federalist. He has been running the post office for a couple of years, and he changed the policy of the post office in one particular regard. He eliminated post riders, that is, individual people who would take the mail from one city to another, and then it would be taken by another post rider on to someplace else. And he started using stagecoaches to deliver the mail, much more reliable and cheaper. And so that was the new policy. Well, this was the annual contract. Come along January 1788, and the stagecoach operators started, in the new contract, they gouged the Confederation government. They said, we're going to charge you a lot more money. And so Hazard decided, no, I'm not going to be blackmailed into paying more money. I'm going back to the old system where we go by post riders, and people pay the post riders to deliver the mail. And so no more consistency in the stagecoach operators. This is a fairly powerful lobbying entity, the stagecoach operators. So you don't want to antagonize them, and Hazard did. Now, the other side is the question of newspapers, and that newspapers are, the circulation is being stifled. It costs money to send your newspapers in the mail. What didn't cost money was when one newspaper printer exchanged his newspaper with another newspaper printer. And that's how information was circulated in America. I mentioned that there were 90 newspapers at the time. And so let's say a newspaper printer in Philadelphia might have an arrangement with a printer in Hartford, Connecticut, in Richmond, Virginia, and maybe in Charleston. And they would exchange each other's newspapers, and they would do a cut and paste job getting the information from one newspaper to another. And so the newspaper printer, let's say in Richmond, would take news from Philadelphia and put it under the dateline. Most newspapers were 4 pages long, and the political news was often on page 2 and 3. But this Richmond printer might put on page 3 a dateline, Philadelphia, 25 October. And that would be the latest news from Philadelphia. Well, that kind of arrangement, there's no news services. There's no UPI, no AP, no New York Times news service. It was this unofficial kind of arrangement among the printers themselves. Hazard changed the policies at this time in January, saying no longer is this free exchange of newspapers, but you too have to pay for the postage. And so they didn't like that at all. And so there's great opposition. And it turns out there seemingly is a difficulty in getting newspapers from the South up north, and particularly newspapers that have Luther Martin's Genuine Information coming from Maryland up north, getting the dissent of the minority of the Pennsylvania Convention out of Philadelphia into other newspapers. And so Anti-Federalists are saying that there's a stifling of the circulation of newspapers, and the mails are being tampered with. Now, often what is happening is these post riders who have sort of saddlebags, portmanteaus they're called, filled with letters and newspapers, and they're fairly heavy, and they're going throughout the countryside, and they stop, maybe get a little drink at a tavern on the way, and they see these newspapers in there, and they decide, well, you know, I can take that newspaper in that tavern and sell it for a penny or two, and I get some income, and I don't have to carry that newspaper. And so the circulation of newspapers is being damaged here somehow. Now, whether it's orchestrated by Hazard and his subordinates in the post office, who knows? But certainly newspaper printers, Federalists, as not just Anti-Federalists, but Federalists also, complain about this new policy that the post office has in charging for the delivery, new policy of going with post riders, not stagecoaches, and they say this is a critical time. George Washington gets word of this, and he complains to his good friend John Jay in New York, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, in fact, the de facto Prime Minister of the United States. And Washington says, who is this postmaster? What is he doing? Tell him to stop. This is not a good thing. This is giving us bad a reputation here, Federalists, that we're trying to stop this information getting out. And it's not surprising. When Washington becomes president, he reappoints almost all the Confederation officials, but not Ebenezer Hazard. He is dismissed as Postmaster General of the United States. Now, I must say that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both sort of contribute to this because both of them publish satirical pieces in the form of purloined letters that have been obtained in some surreptitious fashion. And they're named, in the Federalist case, they publish letters from Marjorie. That's the pseudonym for George Bryant, the supposed author of the Sentinel Essays. And in the case of the Anti-Federalists, they published fictitious satirical letters signed James D. Caledonian to James Bowdoin. James D. Caledonian is a nickname for James Wilson of Pennsylvania. James Bowdoin is the former governor of Massachusetts who suppressed Shays' rebellion and thought to be quite aristocratic. And so the argument would be, the Anti-Federalist argument would be, you're tampering with the mail, aren't you? You say no. How'd you get those letters? You said that these are real letters of Marjorie. How did you get the letters if you didn't steal them and you're publishing them? And so it seemed that that use of that technique was sort of proof that the Anti-Federalists had that the mails were being looked at. Elbridge Gerry said, I was going into the post office in Boston, and someone told me there's a letter for me in there. And I went in, he said, and to ask for my letter, and the postmaster there said, there's no letter here for you. What happened to my letter? He doesn't know what happened to his letter. So there are charges that the post office individually and the headquarters, which the post office is headquartered in New York City at this time, are contributing to a stifling of the circulation of newspapers and letters.
It's often been said, in fact, one historian said that the Anti-Federalists were men of little faith. Do you see that as an accurate description of the Anti-Federalists?
Well, that was Cecilia Kenyon in the 1950s from Smith College, and that was her interpretation. And she said these were men of little faith because they didn't like the idea that this new government would have so much power, and that they would exercise that power appropriately. Therefore, they had little faith. I take an exact opposite point of view to that, saying these men had great fear and suspicion of government. A lot of that was based upon their reading of history in all time, but particularly the history of England in the 17th century and their own American colonial history. They had experienced a great deal of government oppression. Sometimes no, in Pennsylvania, no, William Penn was not oppressive, but in other cases there was oppression. And they also understood, the Anti-Federalists, that they were in a political environment in their state in opposition to another party. And so in New York, you have the Clintonian Party, Governor George Clinton, and the Anti-Clintonians. The Anti-Clintonians were made up of different factions, including Hamiltonians and Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, Schuyerites. Well, the Clintonians, who pretty much are Anti-Federalists, they hate the Hamiltonians and they hate the Schuyerites. And yet the Hamiltonians and the Schuyerites are Federalists. The Clintonians are Anti-Federalists. They're willing, the Clintonians, the Anti-Federalists in New York, are willing to trust their opponents who they hate with a passion. And they don't trust at all, but they're willing to go along with this new Constitution that might become oppressive with only the hope that there might be amendments in the future. And in fact, the Federalists are not promising amendments, but they're saying we will submit proposals for amendments to the first Congress and we'll see what happens. So I think really the Anti-Federalists were men of great faith, and they shelved their suspicion and their opposition to their opponents, and they acquiesced peacefully. It's an amazing thing that this revolution in favor of government saw so very little violence and very, very little bloodshed in it. And it's primarily because those who were opposed to it acquiesced. And sometimes that acquiescence became even stronger. So if you look at a man like John Quincy Adams, he's 19 years old at this time, so he's just a young man studying law in Newburyport, Massachusetts, under a staunch Federalist. John Quincy Adams was an Anti-Federalist, even though his father supported the Constitution. But once Massachusetts adopted the Constitution, John Quincy Adams changes. He says, I'm a Republican. I'm a believer in a Republican form of government, and we believe that the majority should rule. And consequently, the majority of Massachusetts folks voted, and they wanted this Constitution, therefore I'm supporting it. And so he becomes a staunch advocate for the Constitution. And so I would say, for the most part, Anti-Federalists were men of great faith, not of little faith.
Let's move to the third part of the question, the second bullet, more about the processes. At this time, what were the different ways that constitutions were ratified? There were several. So if you could talk a little bit about the various methods that were used at this time.
Most of the state constitutions were these revolutionary constitutions that were drafted in 1776, and the last really being drafted in 1783, were drafted by provincial congresses. They were legislatures. The New York Provincial Congress came together and they adopted the Declaration of Independence, and then they changed their name and they became the Provincial Convention. In Virginia, you have the Provincial Convention. There are 5 conventions, and they deal with their state constitutions. They're drafting them, bills of rights and state constitutions. Almost all of these end up by saying, that's it, the Constitution's in effect. All they have to do is to elect the delegates. And so in New York is a good example. They finished their work in Kingston, New York, and the 20th of April, 1777, and the provincial convention says it's in effect. And elections are scheduled for June and July. And they elect their government officials, including the governor, and they take office. So there's no formal ratification. It's ratification by fiat, that is F-I-A-T, by saying it's in effect, it's been ratified. That policy sort of changes in 1778 when the Massachusetts Provincial Congress drafts its constitution and declares it in effect. Well, the people come back and say, no, we don't like that. We want to have involvement in the adoption of that constitution. And so there's another convention that's called specifically called to draft a constitution. Not just to be a legislature, but the people have authorized them. I should mention that in New York, for instance, the reason why you have the fifth provincial Congress called is because the fourth was not elected and empowered to write a constitution. And so the word goes out, this new body will be writing a constitution. And so once they adopt the Declaration of Independence on the 9th of July, they change their name to a convention, and they then write that convention, that constitution. And so that's what's done in Massachusetts. You have a new provincial convention that's called. It just happens to be called together in 1779. What makes that so important? Well, that's the 6-month period of time that John Adams happens to be home from France. And he's elected to that convention, and he becomes the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution. It goes back to the towns, and they consider the different provisions. They report back to another convention, and that convention does the tabulation. Well, their adding machines, their calculators are not in the best working order, and there probably were a number of provisions that a majority of the towns opposed, but that's not what the convention said. The convention said the people of Massachusetts have adopted this Constitution, and so it was that process. Same process was used in New Hampshire, that is writing their second Constitution. New Hampshire and South Carolina wrote temporary constitutions in late 1775, early 1776, when Congress recommended to the two of them that you create temporary constitution in the hope that we'll get reconciled with the British. Well, when that doesn't happen and independence is declared, both South Carolina and New Hampshire have to write permanent constitutions. And so it takes New Hampshire 7 years to write its permanent constitution. And they follow the Massachusetts technique. That is, the people are informed that the delegates you're voting for are writing a constitution, and then they come back and the people approve that constitution, and it is approved, and it goes into effect. So that's the form of ratification. The Articles of Confederation was drafted by Congress, took a year and a half, 1776, and then to November of 1777, and they sent it to the states for the state ratifications by the state legislatures. And so that ratification process was done at that point. And all of the states submitted their ratifications over a period of 3.5 years. Took that long. Several of the states held out. The initial flow of states came in. 9 states ratified very quickly. But the ratification process said all 13. And so the delegates came in. Many of them had amendments that were proposed. Congress considered the amendments and rejected them all. So there were a lot of amendments that came in. None of them were accepted. And then they were waiting for the other 4 laggard states. And the last one to come in was Maryland. It didn't want to come in right away because the western lands, that they had none. They had no western lands. And they wanted to share in some of those western lands. Why should Virginia have all of the territory north and west of the Ohio River and lands in western Virginia, that is Kentucky, when it's federal forces that are freeing that land? Many of those federal forces are Marylanders. Why should the Marylanders not get the advantage of that land just as the Virginians have? So they want that change. And they're not going to ratify the Articles of Confederation until that change takes place. Well, in late 1780, it's a down year for the Revolution. And pressure is put on the Marylanders, and they finally ratify in February 1781. And their delegates actually signed the document on the 1st of March, 1781. And that's when it's thought that the Articles of Confederation is adopted. So you see that process. The document goes out. Often it has a cover letter explaining what the document is about, and then there should be a ratification process. The old technique of ordering it by fiat, this Constitution is going to affect, is no longer operative in America. It's going to be the states ratifying. But the only question is, how will the states ratify? Will it be the state legislatures, which is what is provided in the Articles of Confederation, Article 13. It says that any amendment to the Articles will be approved by all of the state legislatures. First approved by Congress, the proposal goes out of Congress, and then it goes to the states to be ratified by all of the state legislatures. So that's the process in being at the time. It's not the process that the Constitutional Convention decides to use.
Which leads me to this question. In your view, why did the delegates choose the route that they did for ratification? Because there, as you've explained, there's so many options. They chose a particular path. Why is that so?
It's obvious that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention who favor the Constitution would like to take the easiest road toward ratification. They don't want to go the hard road or the impossible road. And that's what Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation for ratification is. It's impossible. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention realize that Rhode Island will not ratify. It didn't send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Therefore, unanimity is out of the question. A good chance that New York won't ratify. 2 of its 3 delegates left early. They didn't like what was going on. A very good chance that Massachusetts might not ratify, or Virginia might not ratify. So they're faced with that dangerous prognosis that it's impossible to get unanimity. So the question is, how many states do we need for ratification? And obviously, you have to have at least a majority, so that's 7. And then the next argument is, well, if those are small states, we may not get a majority of the people. So what do we need as far as a legitimate majority of the people or the states? And they fell back on a number that they said they were familiar with. That is, under the Articles, it took the vote of 9 states to do very important things: to declare war, to admit new states, to borrow money, to enter into treaties. 9 states. So they said, okay, let's say 9 states are needed. The expectation was, if we have 9 states, that's a super majority, we'll probably have a majority of the people, no matter what those 9 states are. So that was good. There was a discussion, do we need more states if the states that ratify are not congruous? If they're divided, will we need more than 9 states? Well, they said no. But that was a certain danger. And so toward the end of the ratification process, you have New York that's out and Virginia that's out. And the New Yorkers and the Virginians would say, you don't have a viable government without New York and Virginia in the Union. It divides the new United States into 3 parts, which is exactly what the British tried to do in the Revolution, to separate the New England states from the other states, to separate the Deep South from the other states. And so they felt, no, let's just go with 9 states. And the new government would go into effect among the 9 ratifying states once they ratified. The question would come up, what about those 4 other states? And for the most part, Federalists avoided that issue. And they said, well, they'll come along. They'll decide it's best to come in. They addressed that issue in a little different fashion later on. But so that's the process of how many states are needed. Now, how do they go about ratifying? Do they use state legislatures? Well, this Constitution is taking away a lot of the powers of the state legislatures. And so it would be rather unlikely that all the state legislatures would like to give up power. And they're pretty much permanent bodies. And so there is the decision, let's go to ratifying conventions. These are ad hoc bodies that they'll come together for one purpose, that is to consider the Constitution. They're not going to give up power or gain power. They're there briefly and then they're gone. And so there won't be a natural aversion to that body giving up power. So the convention was good in that regard. There's another reason for going to conventions. These Federalists, all of these people at this time, but particularly the Federalist leadership, they're great politicians. They understand politics inside and out. And they understand if we go to state legislatures, first of all, they're going to be occupied with other issues. They're going to have pre-existing political parties, and they won't want to give up their power. So the ad hoc conventions will not suffer from any of that. Furthermore, there are 11 bicameral legislatures in only 2 states, Pennsylvania and Georgia, that have a unicameral assembly, a unicameral legislature. And so if you go with unanimity, and if you go with state legislatures, you've got 24 political bodies that you've got to get to ratify. So if you go to state conventions, if you go to 9, let's say, you only have 9, but if you stay with legislatures, that means you might have as many as 18 or as few as 16 bodies. Let's say the 2 unicameral states are in, and then you need 7 other bicameral states. That's 16. 16 gauntlets that you've got to run through to get ratification. If you have a convention, it's 1 gauntlet, 1 contest that you have to win, that convention. And so it's going to be a lot easier. You don't have to convince the assemblies and the councils or the senates of the states. And so there's another reason that the theorists, and Madison is one of those, he brings forth and he says, the legislatures are just representatives of the people. And if they ratify, another legislature can come by 4 or 5 years later and unratify and leave the Union. But he says if we have conventions, those are constituent bodies of the people. And so it would be like the people coming together. You can't have all the people. You can't have, in the case of Virginia, you can't have 800,000 people coming together to consider the issue. But you can have a representative form of government. You can have delegates that will come together in the name of the people, and they can consider the Constitution and either adopt or reject. And it will give a permanency that's there. The next legislatures that come into session, they won't have the ability to negate what the constituent body of the people, the convention, had rendered. And so there are both political and theoretical reasons given for the ratification process that the Federalists come up with. It's ingenious what they do, and they're criticized roundly by the Anti-Federalists for violating, delegates violating their instructions, at coming up with a brand new form of government, not just amendments, but they're also criticized for violating the Articles of Confederation that call for a process of ratification that was thrown away. So there is no approbation of Congress that's needed, and there is no state legislatures that needed to ratify the Constitution. Only 9 conventions, and one of the parts of the report of the Constitutional Convention, you have the Constitution, the cover letter from Washington to the President of Congress, and then you have 2 resolutions of the convention. One of them is how to implement the Constitution once it's adopted, but the first resolution before that is requesting Congress to send the Constitution to the states so that they, the state legislatures, can call conventions to consider the Constitution. There's an interesting thing that occurs. Every state calls a convention except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island over and over again rejects calling a convention. What they do at first, their state legislature calls a referendum on the Constitution. There are 30 towns in Rhode Island. They're to meet on the 24th of March, 1788, in town meeting and vote individually. All the freemen are to vote. And what they do is they overwhelmingly defeat the Constitution. Many of the Federalist towns boycott that referendum, and the Federalists say this is very undemocratic. Now, it's a bit shocking. Submitting the Constitution to the people is undemocratic. How do you explain that? Well, their argument is this. When you go to a convention, you might be instructed, maybe not. You come with an open mind, supposedly, and you debate the Constitution, and you might come as an anti-federalist. But you might be convinced in the convention with great insight offered by Federalist speakers. They might convince you that, hey, you were wrong and that you ought to trust this new Constitution, and you change your vote. But when you come together in the town meeting, you don't have the opportunity to debate the Constitution. You're there for an hour or two maybe, and that's all. And maybe there's no one in that town that can appropriately defend the Constitution. And perhaps there's somebody in that town, an anti-federalist leader, that's the local poobob, the local nabob, and if you vote against him, you vote opposite, he will punish you in some fashion, not support you or ostracize you. And so the public voting in town meetings is not as democratic as it might seem. It doesn't give you the best result. Edmund Burke in England said that the best representatives were those who came together and they were not errand boys carrying a instruction from their delegates, but it was a knowledgeable representative who could debate the issues and then vote what was best for their country. And Federalists said that's the best way to do it in state ratifying conventions.
You've already alluded to some of the really critical, important states, but if you could talk a little bit about the importance of Massachusetts in the ratification process.
Massachusetts is one of three large states. There are three large states in America. Virginia is the largest. It has a population of 800,000 people. Not only is it the largest population, it's the largest geographically. It includes both Kentucky and West Virginia at that time. It used to include all of the Northwest Territory. It ceded that to Congress, and that included the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So Virginia was very, very big, and it was known as the Old Dominion. So it's a large state. But Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are the other two large states. The next state in line, as far as a population, would be North Carolina. It's a middle state, really, as is New York at the time. So Massachusetts is the one large state in New England. It's pretty influential in New England. 5 states ratified very quickly. 3 of those 5 unanimously. And that's Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia. 2 other states, Pennsylvania and Connecticut, ratify with 2/3 in favor of the Constitution. So Massachusetts is the 6th state to come along. The big state in New England, there's a previous New England state, that's Connecticut, that did ratify in January of 1788. The Massachusetts Convention convenes in January, and they don't know what's going to happen there. They're uncertain because there are almost 400 delegates. There are about 350 towns in Massachusetts. Never before did all of the towns send delegates to their state House of Representatives. And so many of these people are unknown from the backcountry of Massachusetts. The reason they didn't send delegates is because they couldn't afford to send delegates. It cost money to employ these folks and to pay room and board for them and travel. And so there weren't 50 or so of the delegates never showed up for the House of Representatives. But now it's different. All the towns are represented in Massachusetts because the state government is going to pay for the expenses of these delegates. And so even the far western towns and the island towns in Massachusetts are sending delegates. No one knows their political positions. And so they debate the Constitution for 3 weeks in the Massachusetts Convention. The president of the convention, Governor John Hancock, quite the demagogue. He wanted to be elected president of the convention, but he wanted to test the political winds. He wants to be on the winning side. He doesn't know what that is. So he conveniently gets an attack of the gout. Hancock was known for that. Whenever he wanted to avoid taking a political stand, the gout would attack him and he'd have to stay home. The gout is a very painful illness, and I know I have the gout sometimes. Fortunately, there's a medication today that will alleviate any attacks of the gout. They didn't have that back 200 years ago. And it could be painful for 6 months at a time. You could hardly walk on an ankle or a toe that had the gout. So Hancock stays home. Samuel Adams is on record as being an anti-Federalist. There's a movement to try to stifle Samuel Adams. His power base, the Boston tradesmen and mechanics, they meet at the Green Dragon Tavern. How many were there? If the report comes out, as many stars are in the sky. Lots of delegates there. And they put forth resolutions saying anybody who opposes the convention is not a friend of ours. So Samuel Adams is notified, be careful if you want to maintain your political power source here. Well, after 3 weeks of debating, the Federalists realize they're going to lose. A vote will defeat the Constitution. So this leadership, they go to Hancock, even though they're political enemies. And they say to Hancock, even though we hate you and everything that you stand for, we're going to support you in your bid to be reelected governor. It's an annual term in the spring of 1788. If you do us a favor, that is, submit a list of 9 amendments, recommendatory amendments, not amendments that will be previous, that you have to adopt these before Massachusetts ratifies. But these will be amendments that will be submitted to the First Federal Congress. Submit these as your own, and we'll support you for governor. We'll also support you to be Vice President of the United States. And then they said to Hancock, you know, John, there's no guarantee Virginia will ratify the Constitution. And if Virginia doesn't ratify, George Washington will not be eligible to be the first president. What do you think, John? The next day, John Hancock was carried into the Massachusetts Convention on a litter, and he held up a slip of paper saying, do I have a plan for you, a compromise plan? I've got 9 recommendatory amendments. And with that, the Massachusetts Convention ratifies the Constitution by a majority of 19. It's very, very close. Without that ratification, it's doubtful that New Hampshire would have ratified. Certainly Rhode Island doesn't ratify. And in fact, all the other states that come after Massachusetts, there are 7 more, all except for Maryland, and there's a reason why Maryland stands out, but all the other states adopt the Massachusetts form of ratification. They ratify unconditionally, but they propose recommendatory amendments. Without that process, without that new form of ratifying, it's doubtful that the Constitution would have been ratified in the form that it was. Up until Massachusetts, whenever Anti-Federalists in the conventions, those first 5 conventions, whenever they proposed amendments, their opponents, the Federalist opponents, would say, no, you can't do that. You must ratify or reject the Constitution in toto. Adopt or reject the entire Constitution. That's a dangerous game you're playing. And that game was lost in Massachusetts. But these adept politicians, these Federalist politicians, understood the next alternative. And they enlisted their political enemy, and they got this new form of ratifying, unconditional ratification with recommendatory amendments. That's what guarantees the ratification process will be successful.
I'd like to conclude with perhaps one of the most thorny questions that plague historians, and that's, did the states ratify the Constitution, or did the people ratify the Constitution?
Yes, is the answer to that. James Madison is one of the co-authors of the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist number 39, he looks at different aspects of the Constitution to determine whether it's a Federalist or Nationalist. And by Federalist, he means the people in the states. or does he, he means the states basically. In the national side, he means the people looking at it from a national government. And so there are different attributes. The House of Representatives is a national body that is elected by the people directly into that body. The Senate, on the other hand, is a federalist body that is elected by the state legislatures. And so what he says about ratification is the ratification process partakes of both. It is a national ratification, that is, the people do the electing of the conventions. But the conventions are state conventions, so it smacks of the federal side. And so it is both. It is both a ratification by the states and by the people. Now, when you get into some theory, the question is it a compact or is it a contract? Is it a compact among the states or is it a contract among the people? And so I think what Madison would say is it is not a compact among the states. And consequently, a state cannot leave. Once you ratify, you're in. But this was a contract here among the people. And that's why in the preamble, it's so important that you have those first three words, we the people. That's a Johnny-come-lately phrase that is added to the Constitution. Before that, similar to what's in the Articles of Confederation, it says, we the states. And then it lists the states in order. Now, as far as and that implies it is a compact among those states. The problem that exists in the Constitutional Convention is twofold. One, very superficial. When you list all the states, what happens if some states don't ratify? Then it is not a compact among those states. If you list all 13 states and Rhode Island doesn't ratify, or New York doesn't ratify, well, they shouldn't be in that list because they haven't ratified. So you don't want that. So they strike out all those states, and you put down, instead of we the states, you could have just left it there, but you put down we the people. You want this to be adopted by the people so that it is a contract. And the Federalists use the argument that the sovereignty now has been transferred away from the states into the people. The people are sovereign, and they then elect their governments, whether it be, and they empower their governments, whether it be the federal government, the national government that is established now, or the state governments. And so the people are the ones that have that unified sovereignty. And so when it comes to who ratified, the states ratified and the people ratified, but I think the Federalists would swing more toward it was the people who ratified and not the individual states. The Anti-Federalists, they use this argument throughout the country. Samuel Adams writes a letter and he says, I stumble at the threshold, that we the people. Patrick Henry in the convention says, this is inappropriate. It should not be we the states, the people. It should be we the people. Confederations, he says. This is a confederation. It is made up of states, not of people. And so the Anti-Federalists would argue that this should be a constitution ratified by the states and not by the people. And so that argument is one that's ongoing, and the ratification process helps to settle the issue, and I think the issue is, in fact, settled in favor of the people being sovereign, and they're the ones who have empowered the Constitution.
Well, thank you, John, and we look forward to spending some time with you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.